They said I wasn't worth inviting to Dad's 60th birthday party because I was just the family failure who never amounted to anything. But when Colonel Martinez stood up at that dinner table, looked directly at me with tears in his eyes, and said the words that would change everything, my parents finally understood who their daughter really was. The crystal chandelier above us caught the light from the candles scattered across the mahogany table, casting dancing shadows on faces that had spent years looking at me with disappointment. The expensive wine glasses sat untouched as every person in that room held their breath, waiting to hear what this decorated military officer had to say about the daughter they thought they knew. Little did they know that for the past 8 years, while they believed I was wasting my life, I had been saving others. The irony wasn't lost on me that it would take a stranger's words to make my own family see me clearly for the first time. That night, as I stood in my simple black dress among their designer gowns and tailored suits, I realized that sometimes the truth has a way of surfacing when you least expect it. The same parents who had whispered about my failures to relatives were about to learn that their greatest disappointment was actually their greatest pride. But I'm getting ahead of myself, and you deserve to know how we got to that moment when everything changed. The moment when silence fell like a heavy curtain over the most important dinner of my father's life. The moment when I finally understood that being underestimated had been my greatest protection and my most painful burden. This is the story of how I went from being the uninvited daughter to being the one person in that room who truly mattered. Before I take you back to where this all began, I want to know you're here with me on this journey. Just say listening in the comments below, or let me know where you're tuning in from tonight. I love knowing how far these stories travel and how they touch hearts in places I've never been. Your presence means everything to me as I share something this personal. Growing up as the middle child in the Harrison family meant learning early that love came with conditions and approval had to be earned through achievement. My older brother Marcus had been the golden boy since birth, graduating valedictorian from Stanford before earning his MBA from Wharton and landing a position at Goldman Sachs that made my father beam with pride at every family gathering. My younger sister Claire had inherited my mother's beauty and grace, becoming a successful interior designer whose work graced the pages of Architectural Digest and whose engagement to a prominent surgeon had given my parents endless bragging rights at the country club. Then there was me, Sarah, the one who had somehow missed the memo about what it meant to be a Harrison. While Marcus collected awards and Claire collected admirers, I collected what my family considered failures. I had dropped out of law school after 2 years, claiming it wasn't for me, which had prompted my father to stop speaking to me for 3 months. I had turned down a lucrative position at my uncle's investment firm to pursue something my mother called a phase that would pass. I lived in a modest apartment across town instead of the prestigious neighborhood where my siblings had settled, and I drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic while they cruised in luxury sedans that announced their success to the world. Family dinners became exercises in subtle humiliation, where conversations flowed around my accomplishments because there were supposedly none worth mentioning. My mother would ask Marcus about his latest merger and Claire about her newest celebrity client, while I sat quietly cutting my food and wondering why I kept showing up to these gatherings that made me feel invisible. The pattern became so predictable that I started arriving late and leaving early, claiming work obligations that my family assumed were just excuses to avoid facing my own mediocrity. They never asked what kind of work I did, and I never volunteered the information. The truth was that my work didn't fit into their neat categories of success, and explaining it would have required them to see me as someone other than their disappointing daughter. While Marcus moved millions of dollars around on spreadsheets and Claire transformed rich people's houses into magazine spreads, I spent my days in places that would have horrified my image-conscious family. I worked in neighborhoods they drove through with locked doors, in buildings they would never enter, with people they would cross the street to avoid. My hands, which my mother always criticized for not having regular manicures like Claire's, were often dirty from the work I did. My clothes, which never seemed expensive enough for family photos, were chosen for durability rather than fashion because they needed to withstand conditions that would ruin Claire's designer outfits in minutes. I had learned to keep my two worlds completely separate because I knew that my family's version of love couldn't stretch wide enough to encompass who I really was. They loved the idea of having successful children more than they loved their actual children, and I had accepted my role as the one who would never measure up to their standards. It was easier to be dismissed than to fight for understanding that might never come. The phone call came on a Tuesday evening in March, when the spring rain was drumming against my apartment windows, and I was finally settling in after a particularly challenging day. I almost didn't answer when I SAW my mother's name on the caller ID, because conversations with her had become exercises in diplomatic avoidance of topics that might lead to disappointment. Her voice carried that particular tone she used when she was about to deliver news she knew I wouldn't like but felt obligated to share anyway. She told me about the party they were planning for Dad's 60th birthday, a celebration that would bring together relatives from across the country, colleagues from his law firm, and friends from their social circle for what she described as the event of the year. She talked about the venue they had chosen, an exclusive private dining room at the city's most prestigious hotel, and the menu they had planned with the executive chef who usually only catered to celebrities and politicians. She mentioned the guest list that included judges and senators, business leaders and socialites, everyone who mattered in their world of influence and importance. Then came the pause that I should have recognized as a warning, the slight hesitation that preceded the words that would cut deeper than any criticism she had ever delivered. She explained that they had limited seating and had to make difficult choices about the guest list, that they wanted to keep it to people who really knew Dad professionally and personally, people who could appreciate what he had accomplished in his career. The implication was clear even before she said it directly. They didn't think I belonged at my own father's milestone birthday celebration. Not because of space constraints or venue limitations, but because I wasn't successful enough to sit at their table. I wasn't accomplished enough to be introduced to their friends. I wasn't impressive enough to represent their family values to the people whose opinions mattered to them. My mother's voice became gentle in that way that made her cruelty seem like kindness, explaining that they thought I might be more comfortable sitting this one out since I would probably feel out of place among Dad's professional associates anyway. She suggested that we could have a quiet family dinner the following weekend, just the five of us, where I could give Dad my birthday wishes without the pressure of being around so many important people. The message was unmistakably clear, packaged in the soft language of consideration but delivered with the sharp edge of exclusion. I was being uninvited from my father's birthday party because my presence would be an embarrassment to them. Because in their minds, I was the daughter who had failed to launch, the middle child who had never found her way, the family member who brought down the overall impression of Harrison family success. They were protecting their image by leaving me out, and they expected me to be grateful for their thoughtfulness in sparing me the discomfort of not fitting in. After I hung up the phone, I sat in my small living room listening to the rain and feeling the familiar ache of being perpetually on the outside of my own family circle. The apartment felt smaller somehow, the walls pressing in with the weight of a lifetime of being found wanting by the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. I looked around at my modest furnishings, my secondhand books, my simple life that had never been enough for them, and I felt something shift inside me that I had never experienced before. It wasn't the usual sadness or resignation that came with family disappointment. It wasn't even anger, though that was certainly there underneath everything else. It was something harder to define, a crystallization of resolve that surprised me with its clarity and strength. For 28 years, I had accepted their version of who I was, had internalized their disappointment until it became my own identity, had shrunk myself down to fit into the small space they had carved out for their failing daughter. But sitting there in the rain-soaked quiet of my apartment, I realized that their inability to see me didn't actually change who I was. Their blindness to my worth didn't diminish my value. Their shame about my life didn't make my choices wrong. I thought about the last 8 years, about the path I had chosen that had led me so far from their expectations, but so close to my own sense of purpose. I thought about the people whose lives I had touched, the situations I had navigated, the skills I had developed in service of something bigger than personal success or family approval. I thought about the recognition I had received from people who understood the value of the work I did, even if my family never would. I thought about the letters and commendations tucked away in my desk drawer, the certificates and acknowledgments that proved my worth to those who mattered in my professional world, even if they meant nothing to the people who shared my last name. The rain kept falling, but inside my apartment, something was clearing up that had been cloudy for far too long. I was done accepting their limited vision of who I could be. I was done shrinking to fit their narrow definition of success. I was done being invisible in my own family's story. That night, as I sat in my simple apartment wearing my comfortable clothes and living my authentic life, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to that party whether they wanted me there or not. Not to cause a scene or create drama, but because I had finally realized that I had as much right to celebrate my father's milestone as anyone else in that room. Because I was tired of hiding who I really was to protect their feelings about who they thought I should be. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation that felt both familiar and entirely foreign to me. I was used to preparing for challenging situations, but those usually involved equipment checks and safety protocols, not choosing the right outfit for a social event where I would be the uninvited guest. I stood in my closet looking at clothes that suddenly seemed inadequate for the evening ahead, not because they weren't nice enough, but because they would mark me immediately as different from the other guests. My wardrobe reflected my priorities, filled with practical pieces that could withstand the demands of my real life rather than the designer labels that would signal my belonging in my family's world. I settled on a simple black dress that was elegant enough for the venue, but not so formal that it would look like I was trying too hard to fit in. I chose comfortable shoes that would allow me to stand confidently no matter how long the evening lasted. And I kept my jewelry minimal, because the accessories that mattered most to me weren't the kind you could wear to a dinner party. As I got ready that Saturday evening, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror and saw something I hadn't noticed before. The face looking back at me didn't look like a failure. It looked like someone who had lived fully and authentically, someone whose experiences had carved character into her features, someone whose eyes held stories that would surprise anyone who took the time to really look. My hands, which my mother always criticized, showed the evidence of meaningful work. My posture, which had never been trained in finishing school like Claire's, carried the confidence of someone who knew her own worth even when others couldn't see it. The drive to the hotel felt longer than usual, though the distance was the same as always. I found myself noticing details I usually overlooked, the way the city lights created patterns on my windshield, the way other cars seemed to be carrying people to important destinations while I headed toward my own moment of reckoning. The prestigious hotel rose before me like a monument to the world my family inhabited, all gleaming glass and marble facades that whispered of exclusivity and importance. Valet attendants in crisp uniforms moved efficiently between luxury vehicles, and well-dressed guests swept through the revolving doors with the confidence of people who belonged in such places. I handed my car keys to a young man who smiled politely but whose eyes took in my modest vehicle with the practiced assessment of someone accustomed to serving wealth. The lobby was exactly what I had expected, all soaring ceilings and crystal chandeliers, leather furniture arranged in conversation areas where people spoke in the subdued tones of those accustomed to being heard. I could hear the soft clink of expensive glassware and the murmur of refined conversation drifting from the direction of the private dining rooms. My heels clicked against the marble floor as I made my way toward the sound of celebration, toward the family gathering from which I had been carefully excluded, toward the moment when I would have to decide how much of myself I was willing to reveal to people who had never bothered to look beneath the surface of their assumptions about me. Standing outside the entrance to that private dining room, I could hear my father's laughter mixing with the voices of people who considered themselves important enough to be there. I could picture the scene beyond those doors, the elegant table settings and floral arrangements, the guests in their designer clothes sharing stories about their professional achievements and social connections. I knew my arrival would disrupt the carefully orchestrated evening my mother had planned, would introduce an element of unpredictability into an event designed to showcase their family's success. But I also knew that I was done being edited out of my own family's story. I was done accepting their version of who I was supposed to be. I was done hiding the truth about my life to protect their comfortable illusions about their disappointing daughter. I straightened my shoulders, took a deep breath, and reached for the door handle that would carry me into a room full of people who were about to discover that they had been very wrong about Sarah Harrison. The moment I stepped through those doors, the elegant chatter of the dinner party seemed to pause as if someone had turned down the volume on the entire room. I could feel eyes turning toward me, some curious, some surprised, and from the head table where my family sat, expressions that ranged from shock to mortification. My mother's face went pale beneath her carefully applied makeup, and my father's smile froze in place as he registered my presence at his celebration. Claire dropped her fork with a small clatter that seemed to echo in the sudden quiet, while Marcus straightened in his chair with the kind of rigid posture he used in boardroom confrontations. But I had expected their reaction, had prepared myself for the uncomfortable moment when the uninvited daughter appeared at the party she wasn't supposed to attend. What I hadn't prepared for was seeing Colonel Martinez sitting at a table near the back of the room, his weathered face breaking into a smile of recognition that warmed something deep in my chest. He was older than when I had last seen him, his hair more silver, his uniform bearing new ribbons that spoke of continued service and honor. But his eyes held the same kindness that had gotten me through some of the darkest moments of my life, the same strength that had taught me to find my own courage when everything seemed impossible. He started to rise from his seat, and I knew that the evening I had planned was about to become something entirely different from what I had imagined. But to understand why Colonel Martinez's presence changed everything, you need to know the story I had never told my family, the truth about where I had been and what I had been doing during all those years they thought I was failing at life. The story began 8 years ago, when I walked out of law school and into a recruiting office that would redirect the entire course of my existence. I had been drowning in contracts and torts, suffocating under the weight of my father's expectations and my own growing certainty that a life spent in courtrooms and conference rooms would slowly kill everything authentic inside me. The morning I made my decision, I had been sitting in constitutional law listening to a professor drone about precedent and procedure when I heard sirens racing past the university windows. Something about those urgent voices cutting through the academic calm made me think about the difference between studying life and actually living it. I packed up my books, walked out of that classroom, and drove directly to the Army Recruitment Center downtown. The sergeant who interviewed me was a no-nonsense woman named Rodriguez who asked me tough questions about my motivations and didn't seem impressed by my Ivy League credentials or my family's social standing. She wanted to know if I was running away from something or running towards something, and when I told her I was running toward the chance to do work that actually mattered, she nodded with the kind of understanding that comes from personal experience. The 8 weeks of basic training that followed were the hardest and most transformative of my life, stripping away every assumption I had ever made about my own limitations and rebuilding me into someone capable of things I had never imagined. I learned to push my body beyond what I thought possible, to think clearly under pressure, to work as part of a team where everyone's survival depended on everyone else's competence. I learned to navigate with a compass and stars, to provide medical aid under combat conditions, to make life and death decisions in seconds rather than deliberating for hours like the lawyers I had left behind. But more than the physical skills, I learned something about my own character that my family had never seen and I had never recognized. I learned that I was brave in ways that had nothing to do with academic achievement or social success. I learned that I could be trusted with responsibilities that mattered more than profit margins or client satisfaction. I learned that my worth wasn't measured by the size of my paycheck or the prestige of my address, but by the lives I could touch and the service I could provide to something bigger than myself. When I graduated from basic training, I felt like I was meeting myself for the first time, discovering the person I had always been underneath the layers of family expectation and societal pressure. My first assignment took me to Fort Bragg, where I trained in military intelligence and learned skills that would make me valuable in ways my family could never have imagined. I studied languages that would allow me to communicate in conflict zones, learned to analyze satellite imagery and intercept communications, developed expertise in cultural navigation that would prove essential in diplomatic and humanitarian missions. But it was my assignment to the Psychological Operations Unit that truly found my calling, working with teams that specialized in winning hearts and minds rather than just battles. We were the soldiers who went into communities that had been torn apart by conflict and helped rebuild not just infrastructure but hope. We were the ones who worked with local leaders to establish trust, who distributed medical supplies and educational materials, who protected civilians caught in the crossfire of forces beyond their control. It was dangerous work that required intelligence, courage, and a level of cultural sensitivity that couldn't be taught in any classroom. It was work that took me to places my family had only seen on the evening news, working with people they had never imagined their daughter could understand or help. It was work that earned me recognition from superiors who valued competence over connections, who measured success in lives saved rather than deals closed. During my second deployment, I was part of a humanitarian mission in a region where conflict had left thousands of civilians displaced and desperate. Our team was responsible for establishing safe corridors for aid distribution and working with local leaders to identify families most in need of assistance. It was during this mission that I first worked directly with Colonel Martinez, who was commanding the overall operation with the kind of steady leadership that inspired confidence even in the most chaotic circumstances. He had a reputation for being tough but fair, for demanding excellence while never asking his soldiers to do anything he wouldn't do himself. But what impressed me most about him was his genuine care for the people we were trying to help, his ability to see past political complications to focus on human need. He noticed my work with the local women and children, my ability to communicate across language barriers and cultural differences, my success in building trust in communities where outsiders were viewed with suspicion and fear. When a crisis arose that threatened to derail the entire mission, he asked me to be part of the small team that would negotiate with local leaders and find a solution that could save lives without compromising our objectives. The situation was more complex than anything I had faced before, involving competing tribal loyalties, limited resources, and the constant threat of violence from extremist groups that viewed our humanitarian work as an act of aggression. We were working against time to evacuate a village that had been caught in the crossfire between opposing forces, knowing that every hour of delay increased the danger for civilians who had nowhere else to go. The local elder who controlled access to the safe evacuation routes didn't trust American soldiers, having seen too many promises broken and too many good intentions result in tragedy for his people. Colonel Martinez could have ordered me to follow standard protocol, to work through official channels and hope for the best. Instead, he gave me permission to try something different, to approach the situation with the kind of cultural sensitivity and personal connection that couldn't be mandated by military procedure. I spent 3 days living in that village, eating with families, playing with children, listening to stories of loss and hope from people who had survived more hardship than I had ever imagined. I learned their customs, spoke their language as best I could, and most importantly, I proved that I saw them as human beings worthy of respect rather than just a problem to be solved. When the elder finally agreed to trust us with his people's lives, the evacuation took place without a single casualty, and 237 civilians were moved to safety before the fighting reached their village. The operation became a model for future humanitarian missions, and Colonel Martinez made sure that my role in its success was documented in the official reports. But more than the professional recognition, what mattered to me was the letter I received months later from the village elder's daughter. A young woman studying to become a teacher who wrote to tell me that her family's survival had allowed her to pursue her dreams of educating the next generation. She included a photograph of herself at her university graduation, wearing traditional dress under her academic cap, holding a small American flag alongside her country's colors. That photograph sat on my desk for years, reminding me that sometimes the most important work happens far from the spotlight, in places where success is measured in lives preserved rather than headlines generated. It reminded me that my family's definition of achievement was just one way of measuring a life's worth, and that the path I had chosen had value even if they couldn't see it. Over the next 6 years, I participated in 17 different missions across 4 continents, earning commendations that my family never knew existed and developing expertise that had nothing to do with the kind of success they understood. I became fluent in 3 languages and conversational in 2 more, learned to navigate cultural complexities that would have challenged career diplomats, and developed a reputation among my peers for being someone who could handle sensitive situations with intelligence and grace. I worked with refugees, negotiated with warlords, coordinated medical relief efforts, and helped establish schools in places where education had been interrupted by conflict. I was promoted twice, received the Bronze Star for Valor during a particularly dangerous mission, and was selected for advanced training programs that were offered only to soldiers with exceptional potential. But perhaps most importantly, I discovered who I really was when stripped of all the external expectations and social pressures that had defined my civilian life. I was brave, competent, resourceful, and deeply committed to service in ways that had nothing to do with personal gain. I was someone who could be trusted with important responsibilities, who could make difficult decisions under pressure, who could find solutions to problems that had no easy answers. The irony wasn't lost on me that while my family saw me as their greatest disappointment, the United States Army had identified me as someone with exceptional potential for leadership and service. While my parents whispered about my failures at country club dinners, my commanding officers were recommending me for assignments that were offered only to their most trusted soldiers. While my siblings climbed corporate ladders that impressed their social circle, I was climbing mountains in countries, carrying medical supplies to villages that had never seen an American soldier, building bridges between cultures that had been taught to distrust each other. The recognition I received came in forms my family wouldn't have understood, certificates written in languages they couldn't read, commendations for actions they couldn't imagine their daughter performing, photographs with local leaders and fellow soldiers that documented a life they had never bothered to ask about. I had become someone who mattered in ways that couldn't be measured by salary figures or social status, someone whose absence would be felt by people whose names my family would never know but whose lives had been touched by mine. When my active duty ended 2 years ago, I had been offered positions that would have impressed even my achievement-oriented family, opportunities to work in military intelligence, diplomatic security, or international development that came with prestigious titles and substantial salaries. But I learned something about myself during those years of service that made the traditional markers of success seem less important than finding work that aligned with my values. I chose instead to join a nonprofit organization that specialized in disaster relief and humanitarian aid, work that would allow me to continue serving communities in crisis while building on the skills I had developed during my military service. It was work that took me to hurricane-devastated communities along the Gulf Coast, earthquake zones in remote mountain regions, and refugee camps where families waited for the chance to rebuild their lives in safety. It was work that paid far less than the corporate positions my siblings had chosen, that required me to live simply and travel constantly, that never provided the kind of visible success my parents could brag about to their friends. But it was work that gave me a sense of purpose that no amount of money or social recognition could have provided. The organization I worked for was small but highly respected within the humanitarian community, known for being able to operate effectively in situations where larger agencies couldn't navigate the political or cultural complexities. My military experience made me valuable in ways that had nothing to do with traditional nonprofit skills, allowing me to assess security situations, communicate with military personnel, and work in environments that were too dangerous for volunteers without specialized training. I became the team leader for high-risk deployments, the person they sent when situations required someone who could think tactically while acting compassionately. It was demanding work that tested every skill I had developed and required me to constantly learn new ones. But it was also deeply fulfilling in ways that my family's version of success never could have been. Every mission reminded me that there were different ways to measure a life's impact, and that the work that mattered most to me had nothing to do with impressing people who already had everything they needed. But standing in that hotel dining room, seeing Colonel Martinez's face light up with recognition and pride, I realized that the two worlds I had worked so hard to keep separate were about to collide in ways I couldn't have anticipated. He was rising from his seat with the kind of purposeful movement that suggested he had something important to say, and I could see in his eyes the same respect that had sustained me through years of being undervalued by my own family. The distinguished guests around him were turning to follow his gaze, curiosity replacing their polite dinner conversation as they tried to understand what had captured the attention of this obviously important military officer. My parents were watching from their table with expressions that mixed confusion and growing alarm, probably wondering how their disappointing daughter knew someone who commanded such obvious respect in this room full of influential people. The moment was building towards something I couldn't control and wasn't sure I wanted, but Colonel Martinez was already moving toward me with the kind of determined stride that had carried him through decades of military service and leadership. Colonel Martinez reached me before I had fully processed what was happening, his weathered hand extending toward mine with the kind of firm grip that spoke of absolute certainty and unshakable respect. The conversations around us had quieted to whispers, then to complete silence as every person in that elegant dining room turned to witness this unexpected interaction between a decorated military officer and the woman who wasn't supposed to be there. His voice, when he spoke, carried the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and the warmth of genuine affection that couldn't be manufactured or performed. He told me how proud he was to see me, how he had often wondered what had become of the remarkable young soldier who had earned his deepest respect during some of the most challenging missions of his career. But then he did something that would change the trajectory of that entire evening, something that would shatter every assumption my family had ever made about their disappointing daughter. He turned to face the room full of distinguished guests, his shoulders squared in the military bearing that commanded immediate attention, and he asked if he could share something important about the woman standing beside him. The silence that followed his request was so complete that I could hear the soft clink of ice settling in water glasses and the distant sounds of city traffic filtering through the hotel's expensive windows. My father, who had been frozen in shocked confusion since my arrival, managed a weak nod that suggested he was curious despite his obvious discomfort with the situation. My mother's face had gone through several shades of pale, and I could see her mind racing to calculate the social implications of whatever was about to happen. Claire sat with her mouth slightly open, her usual poise abandoned in the face of something she couldn't control or predict, while Marcus leaned forward with the intense focus he usually reserved for analyzing financial markets. The other guests, senators and judges, business leaders and socialites, all turned their attention to Colonel Martinez with the kind of respectful attention that his presence and bearing commanded. This was clearly a man whose words carried weight, whose opinion mattered in circles that valued achievement and service, whose recognition meant something substantial in the world they all inhabited. And he was about to tell them something about me that would redefine everything they thought they knew about the Harrison family dynamics. Colonel Martinez began by explaining that he had served 42 years in the United States Army, had commanded troops in 7 different countries, and had worked with thousands of soldiers during his distinguished career. He said that in all those years of service, He had encountered very few individuals who possessed the rare combination of courage, intelligence, and compassion that defined truly exceptional soldiers. His voice grew stronger as he continued, telling the room about a young woman who had volunteered for the most dangerous assignments, who had earned the trust of local populations in war-torn regions where Americans were viewed with suspicion and fear. He described missions where cultural sensitivity, and tactical intelligence had been the difference between success and disaster. Operations where the ability to build bridges between conflicting communities had saved countless civilian lives. He spoke about a soldier who had learned multiple languages not for career advancement, but to better serve the people she was trying to help, who had lived in conditions that would have broken lesser individuals, who had earned commendations for valor that most civilians would never hear about because the work was classified and the locations were too sensitive for public recognition. As he spoke, I watched my family's faces transform from confusion to shock to something approaching awe, as if they were learning about a stranger who happened to share my name and features. My father's expression shifted from embarrassment about my unexpected presence to a growing realization that the daughter he had dismissed might be someone entirely different from the person he thought he knew. My mother's social discomfort was giving way to something I had never seen in her eyes before, a kind of respect that she had never shown me during all our years of strained family dinners and disappointed conversations. Claire looked like she was trying to reconcile the sister she thought she knew with the woman Colonel Martinez was describing, while Marcus sat back in his chair with the stunned expression of someone whose fundamental assumptions about reality had just been challenged. The other guests were listening with the kind of focused attention that suggested they understood they were hearing something significant, something that would change how they viewed not just me, but the entire Harrison family dynamic. Colonel Martinez continued his impromptu speech by describing the mission that had cemented his respect for me, the village evacuation that had required not just military precision, but the kind of human connection that couldn't be taught in any training program. He told them about my 3 days live among civilians who had never trusted American soldiers, about the patience and cultural sensitivity I had shown in building relationships that ultimately saved 237 lives. He described the letter from the village elder's daughter, the young woman whose education had been possible because her family survived, whose gratitude had crossed continents and languages to reach the soldier who had helped make her dreams possible. His voice carried the emotion of someone who understood that some achievements couldn't be measured in traditional metrics, that some forms of service created ripple effects that spread far beyond their immediate impact. He spoke about leadership under pressure, about making life and death decisions with incomplete information, about the kind of courage that emerged not from recklessness but from deep commitment to something larger than personal success. When he mentioned my Bronze Star, the silence in the room became even more profound, as if the air itself had thickened with the weight of recognition. Several of the guests leaned forward, their expressions shifting from polite interest to genuine respect as they processed the significance of what they were hearing. A Bronze Star wasn't the kind of achievement that could be dismissed or minimized, wasn't something that could be explained away as luck or circumstance. It represented valor in combat, recognition from the highest levels of military command, the kind of honor that careers were built on and legacies were defined by. My father's face had gone completely white, and I could see him struggling to reconcile this information with his long-held beliefs about my failures and limitations. My mother looked like she was seeing me for the first time, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and something that might have been the beginning of pride. The transformation in their expressions was almost painful to watch, years of dismissal and disappointment crumbling in the face of evidence that their assumptions had been completely wrong. Colonel Martinez then did something that surprised even me, reaching into his jacket pocket to pull out a photograph that I recognized immediately. It was the picture from the village graduation ceremony, the one that had sat on my desk for years, showing the young teacher in her traditional dress and academic cap, holding both flags as symbols of the connection between her dreams and the opportunity that American intervention had provided. He passed the photograph around the table, explaining that this was what real success looked like, what genuine achievement meant when measured in human terms rather than financial ones. He told them about the school that had been built in that village, about the children who were learning to read because their community had survived, about the ripple effects of compassion that spread far beyond any single mission or medal. As the photograph made its way around the room, I watched distinguished guests study it with the kind of attention usually reserved for important documents or artistic masterpieces, understanding that they were looking at evidence of impact that transcended their usual measurements of success. The applause that followed Colonel Martinez's words was unlike anything I had ever experienced, not the polite social clapping that accompanied dinner party toasts, but the kind of sustained, heartfelt recognition that came from genuine respect and admiration. Distinguished guests who had never acknowledged my existence were rising from their seats, their faces showing the kind of appreciation usually reserved for visiting dignitaries or honored heroes. A federal judge who had known my father for 20 years approached me with tears in her eyes, telling me that her own son was deployed overseas and that knowing there were soldiers like me serving gave her hope for his safety and purpose. A prominent businessman whose success had always impressed my parents took my hand and said that in all his years of achievement, he had never done anything as meaningful as what Colonel Martinez had described. The CEO of a major corporation, someone whose approval my father had sought for years, okayed me in the eye and said that real leadership was exactly what I had demonstrated, and that the corporate world could learn from the kind of service I had provided to my country. But it was my family's reaction that affected me most deeply, watching them grapple with the reality that everything they thought they knew about me had been fundamentally wrong. My father approached me with hesitant steps, his usual confidence replaced by something I had never seen from him before, a humility that came from recognizing a mistake so profound it challenged his basic understanding of his own daughter. When he reached me, his voice was barely above a whisper. He asked why I had never told them about my service, why I had let them believe I was failing when I was actually succeeding in ways they had never imagined. I could see the pain in his eyes, the dawning realization that his disapproval had been based on ignorance rather than insight, that his disappointment had been directed at someone who deserved his pride instead of his criticism. My mother stood beside him, tears streaming down her carefully made-up face, reaching for my hand with fingers that trembled with emotion she couldn't quite name. She apologized through her tears, not just for tonight's exclusion, but for years of dismissal, for assumptions that had blinded her to who her daughter really was. Claire approached me next, her usual poise completely abandoned as she struggled to process the disconnect between the sister she thought she knew and the woman Colonel Martinez had described. She told me she had always wondered why I seemed so confident despite their family's constant criticism, why I never seemed broken by their disapproval in the way someone truly failing might have been. She said she had attributed it to stubbornness or denial, never imagining that my quiet strength came from knowing my own worth in ways that had nothing to do with their approval. Marcus, ever the analyst, wanted to understand the practical details, asking about my assignments and training with the kind of focused curiosity he usually reserved for investment opportunities. But underneath his questions, I could hear something else, a respect that had never been present in our previous conversations. An acknowledgement that I had succeeded in arenas that required skills he had never developed and courage he had never been asked to demonstrate. The evening that followed was unlike any family gathering I had ever experienced, conversations flowing in directions that had never been possible when I was seen as the disappointing daughter rather than the decorated veteran. Guests who had initially viewed my uninvited presence as a social awkwardness were now seeking me out, asking about my experiences and expressing genuine interest in the work I had done. My parents found themselves in the unusual position of being proud to introduce me to their friends, discovering that their daughter's achievements were more impressive to their social circle than they had ever imagined possible. The irony wasn't lost on any of us that the daughter they had been to Embarrassed to invite had become the evening's most compelling guest, the person everyone wanted to meet and talk with about experiences that none of them could match. As the formal dinner wound down and guests began to mingle more freely, I found myself in conversations that revealed how narrow my family's definition of success had always been. These were accomplished people, leaders in their fields, individuals who understood that real achievement came in many forms and that service to others represented the highest form of success. They asked thoughtful questions about my humanitarian work, about the transition from military to civilian service, about the skills required to work effectively in crisis situations. They shared their own stories of children in military service, of volunteer work they supported, of their growing understanding that meaning often mattered more than money in creating a life worth living. Several offered business cards with genuine interest in supporting the nonprofit organization I worked for, understanding that their wealth could contribute to the kind of work that actually changed lives. But perhaps the most meaningful conversation of the evening came when my father pulled me aside, away from the social dynamics and public recognition, to speak privately about what he had learned. He told me that he had spent his entire career measuring success in terms that suddenly seemed inadequate, that his understanding of achievement had been challenged by hearing about mine. He apologized not just for tonight's exclusion, but for years of failing to see me clearly, for allowing his own limited vision to blind him to his daughter's actual worth. He said that he had always been proud of Marcus's financial success and Claire's artistic recognition because those were forms of achievement he understood, but that hearing about my service had taught him there were kinds of success that transcended anything he had ever accomplished. His voice broke slightly as he admitted that he was ashamed of how he had treated me, how he had dismissed work that was actually more important than anything he had done in his legal career. My mother's apology came later, in the hotel lobby as guests were leaving and the evening was drawing to its close. She took my hands in hers and looked directly into my eyes with an intensity one had never experienced from her before. She told me that she had been wrong about everything, that her priorities had been so skewed by social expectations that she had missed the extraordinary person her own daughter had become. She said that she had spent years being embarrassed by my choices when she should have been bragging about my service, that she had focused so much on what I wasn't doing that she had completely missed what I was accomplishing. Through her tears, she promised that things would be different going forward, that she would learn to see me clearly rather than through the distorted lens of her own limited expectations. She asked if I could forgive years of blindness and whether there was a way to rebuild our relationship on a foundation of truth rather than disappointment. The drive home that night felt different from any journey I had ever taken, the familiar streets seeming to hold new possibilities as I processed what had happened at my father's birthday celebration. I thought about the evening's transformation, how a moment of recognition from someone who truly knew my worth had shifted not just my family's perception, but my own understanding of how truth eventually surfaces despite our best efforts to hide it. I realized that I had spent years protecting my family from the reality of who I was, allowing them to maintain their comfortable assumptions rather than challenging them to see me clearly. But Colonel Martinez's presence had made that protection impossible, had forced a confrontation with reality that none of us could avoid or minimize. The truth about my service, my achievements, my actual worth had emerged not because I had demanded recognition, but because someone who understood that worth had refused to let it remain hidden. In the weeks that followed that transformative evening, my relationship with my family began to evolve in ways I had never thought possible. My parents started asking genuine questions about my work, expressing interest in the places I had been and the people I had helped. They began to understand that their daughter's path had been different from what they expected, but no less valuable than the traditional success they had always prioritized. Claire reached out to reconnect on a deeper level, admitting that she had always sensed there was more to me than met the eye, but had been too caught up in family dynamics to pursue that intuition. Marcus, perhaps most surprisingly, began to express interest in using his financial expertise to support humanitarian organizations, understanding for the first time that his skills could contribute to work that created meaning beyond profit. The transformation wasn't immediate or complete, because years of established patterns don't change overnight, but it was genuine and growing stronger with each conversation that acknowledged who I really was rather than who they had thought I should be. My parents began including me in family gatherings not as an obligation but as someone whose presence added value to their celebrations. They started mentioning my work to their friends with pride rather than embarrassment, sharing stories about my service that they asked permission to tell. The country club conversations that had once focused on Marcus's latest deal or Claire's newest client began to include references to their guider who had served overseas, who was making a difference in disaster zones, who had earned recognition from military leadership for courage and compassion. But perhaps the most significant change was in my own understanding of what family could be when it was based on truth rather than expectations. I learned that love could evolve and deepen when people were willing to see each other clearly, that relationships could be rebuilt on stronger foundations when honest recognition replaced comfortable assumptions. I discovered that my parents' capacity for pride was much greater than I had ever imagined, but that it had been constrained by their limited vision of what achievement could look like. When that vision expanded to include my actual accomplishments, their love expanded as well, growing into something more authentic and sustainable than anything we had shared before. The invitation to this year's holiday dinner came with a handwritten note from my mother, telling me that my precinct, it wasn't just welcome but essential, that the family gathering wouldn't be complete without the daughter whose service had taught them all what real success looked like. She mentioned that they had invited Colonel Martinez and his wife, wanting to honor the man whose words had opened their eyes to their daughter's true worth. The note ended with words I had never expected to read from her, telling me that she was proud to be my mother and sorry it had taken her so long to recognize what an honor that really was. That upcoming dinner represents something I never thought possible, a family celebration where I will be valued for who I actually am rather than tolerated despite who they thought I was. It represents the triumph of truth over assumption, the victory of recognition over dismissal, the success of authentic love over conditional approval. Most importantly, it represents proof that sometimes the greatest vindication comes not from demanding to be seen, but from living authentically until someone with clear vision reveals your worth to those who had been blind to it. The uninvited daughter had become the guest of honor, not through anger or confrontation, but through the quiet dignity of service and the unexpected gift of recognition from someone who understood what that service truly meant.